Hey, everybody. Welcome to Inside the Courtroom. I'm Erica Stapleton with 12 News in Phoenix. And tonight we have Katie Wilcox, one of our executive producers here, joining us to discuss Lori Vallow Daybell's first murder conspiracy case here in Arizona.
So, Erica, I think, as we've worked on some of this together for so long, I think it's always really valuable to just start with an opening and scene setter. And I'll just say, watching what we saw yesterday, the way that they both have approached this case, the prosecution and then Lori Vallow Daybell representing herself, really lines up what the testimony was about today. So give us a little bit of background to where we are today.
Yeah, so as I said, this is her first murder conspiracy trial here in Arizona. We know her history in Idaho is she was convicted of killing her children, Tylee and JJ, who used to live here, and her role in the death of her current husband, Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy. So she has these three big convictions. She's serving 3 life sentences in Idaho. But then at the end of 2023, she was extradited here to Arizona to stand trial for conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow, and then another case out of Gilbert involving her niece's ex-husband. So we'll focus today on Charles Vallow's case because that's what we heard those opening statements for yesterday. It's been a long time coming for a lot of people involved in this case. And essentially we heard those 2 different stories. Lori saying, hey, this was self-defense. My brother shot Charles in self-defense. And then we also heard from the prosecutor saying, no way was this self-defense. You guys conspired to kill your husband so that you could be with Chad Daybell. So that's really where we left off yesterday.
And what strikes me so much, because as we've been working and I've been kind of working behind the scenes, going back and watching all of your previous coverage from what we were first finding out, I mean, we actually got to hear sometimes from Charles Vallow himself warning about what Lori was doing, how Lori was thinking. And then in that day, getting to see how Lori was reacting. And some of that stuff played out in court in these last 2 days as well. You got to see some body camera.
Yes.
What was that like?
I think it's a combination of not just body camera, but text messages. And then we're hearing from witnesses. So that's really where we picked up today was a Chandler firefighter. We had 2 this morning who are on the stand. And it's interesting because we should mention Lori Vallow Daybell is representing herself in this case. Yeah. That's not something we saw in Idaho. So she has the opportunity to cross-examine people. And it's really interesting to see because, again, we know her history as someone who's been convicted of all these felonies of murder of her own children. And it's not something that the jury knows. So they're watching this play out. So as I'm watching, I'm wondering, what is the jury thinking about all of this?
And you get to see them in a way that we don't. And that's a big part of this being inside the courtroom because, even sitting here in the studio, I'm seeing what the court's feeding back. I'm seeing what we all get to see. You're watching the jury. You're seeing those reactions. What were some of the things that came up with the jury today?
Well, for the most part, they've been really attentive, but we unfortunately had some issues with the court. It was
what happened?
They seated the jury really fast. It took less than 2 days for them to seat a jury. And that wasn't what we saw in her Idaho trial. And we were surprised because we thought it would be challenging to find an impartial jury in this case. And they seated 16. Eventually, 4 would be determined to be alternates. 12 would deliberate. But from yesterday, we lost 1 juror who said his employer had an issue. They decided to let him go because they had, at the time, 3 alternates. And then this morning, the very first thing right off the bat, we heard the judge say, okay, we need to go into sidebar. That's where you hear the white noise. If you're following our court feed live stream, we have it up on KTV Plus and as well as 12 Plus all day. So you could watch this happen as well. But, they had some sort of discussion and we don't know what happened. But as soon as they got off of that, they said, okay, juror number 4 is dismissed. We didn't see this person ever come into the courtroom today. It appeared to have been one of the women on the jury.
Oh, wow.
As we said before, this jury is made up of what appears to be 3 women and 13 men. So now we've lost 1 man, 1 woman, and we are down to 14 people. And we had 2 other possible issues that had to be aired out in court. And one of them was that one of the jurors said he thought he remembered some of the footage they were playing it out yesterday. You mentioned body camera. So he came forward and he told the court that, and the judge asked him questions saying, do you think, is this going to be a problem? And essentially he said, no, I remembered some of it, but I can still make decisions based on your directions in this case. So they ultimately decided to keep that juror. And then this afternoon, when we came back from the lunch break, the prosecution said, hey, we've been advised that one of the jurors may have been on their phone. And, this was right before the jury submitted a question, which you're allowed to do in Arizona. So they had to bring that juror in for questioning. So, you already on the first 2 days of testimony here, we have 2 jurors knocked out and there were some questions about others. So, that's got to be a little unnerving, I would imagine, for all involved in this case, because if you don't have enough jurors, then you can't move forward with the trial.
You mentioned something just now about how there were 3 women on the jury. And I think sometimes when we've talked, and I know you spoke to a prosecutor who thought having more men may be something that Lori Vallow Daybell wanted. Did you have any insight on that?
That was prosecutor Rachel Smith. She was one of the prosecutors who worked the case in Idaho. And she said that Lori, from her perspective and vantage point, is very manipulative, especially when it comes to men. And, we see her now, she's on her 5th husband with Chad Daybell. And you saw what the state is alleging unfolded with Charles, how they conspired to kill him. Yeah. So it is interesting that was the makeup of the jury. And now, it's a possibility. Again, this is thinking way far down the line, but it's a possibility that if, the 2 women are selected as alternates at some point down the road, then it could be a full male jury deciding what happens here. But we don't want to cross that bridge yet, because there's a lot to talk about before we get to that point.
It's really interesting when we're looking at all the testimony today and looking at, Lori Vallow Daybell and how she's acting and how we've seen her act over time. Talk to me a little bit about the cross-examination, what you were seeing.
Well, we started today after that, back and forth with the jury situation.
Once things settled down.
The remaining jurors were brought in, okay. We continued where we left off on Monday's testimony, which is the Chandler firefighter. Okay. And Lori was cross-examining him. And it's interesting because she approaches and she's kind of, some of the witnesses, we've seen a few more today, and she's been a little giggly or like, can I get your name? Can I get this? And I think it speaks to that. Is she trying to, kind of build a relationship with these witnesses that she's talking to? So it's really interesting to see that play out. But what we saw this morning with not just the first Chandler firefighter, but a second, was that this was all about CPR. And why CPR is important is because it goes back to Lori's brother, Alex Cox.
Okay.
Back when this all happened, and again, we should maybe establish that Charles Vallow was shot in July 2019 by Lori's brother, Alex Cox. State is claiming it's a conspiracy. And at the time, Cox said it was self-defense. So that's how we got to this point. But we know that he was the shooter in this situation. And what we learned from the state, at least what they're saying according to the evidence, is that he waited more than 40 minutes to call 911 after Charles was shot. And once he did call 911, our past reporting has said he was given instructions to perform CPR. But what these 2 firefighters testified was that no one performed CPR. Not that they didn't believe that anyone had performed CPR.
They don't think it happened.
No, they don't think it happened.
And we have some sound from this back and forth. I think that'd be great if we could maybe take a listen to this.
Is it possible that if there was a wound to the chest, that doing compressions on that could cause other damage?
I suppose it's possible, but ultimately it doesn't matter. If the heart isn't beating, it's what you got to do. It's the appropriate treatment.
So would a common person who doesn't know how to do CPR maybe hesitate about pushing on a bullet wound?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
But you wouldn't?
Can you repeat the question?
You wouldn't hesitate to push on the bullet wound if the heart was stopped?
No, I wouldn't.
And you would have to assess if the heart was stopped in order to do that?
Yes, you would check a pulse like we did. We would, use our equipment like we did.
And can you tell me about I think there's a word for it, but I'm sorry, I can't remember what it was. The crunch.
When doing the chest compressions?
Correct.
I don't know if there was necessarily a certain word that I used, but you feel the sternum crack. I compare it to, like I said before, cracking your knuckles.
And how much pressure would you have to apply to get the crack?
That could vary, depending on who you're doing CPR on.
They don't always get the crack, right? It's not always going to happen.
If they're doing it forcefully enough, they would.
So if they didn't do it forcefully enough, it wouldn't.
That is possible, yes.
But then when you come in, the professionals, and you apply the correct amount of force, then you would hear the crack.
Yes.
And is that possible that happened in this case?
It is possible.
Okay, no more questions.
All right, redirect.
So what you just heard is Lori Vallow Daybell cross-examining one of the Chandler firefighters.
Yeah.
Kind of saying, hey, is it possible that, someone who's not familiar with this, like my brother, I think is what she's trying to imply.
Right.
Is it possible that this couldn't happen? But on the redirect, the prosecutor said, are you there's other ways to determine that CPR has not been done. And both people who testified about this said they were confident that they were the first to apply CPR in that case.
Yeah. And that's okay. So you actually told me a little bit about some of the instructions that the judge gave Lori Vallow Daybell. And, I had listened to her opening argument yesterday. She's going to make this case that it's all self-defense. And it seemed like where she was going with this is exactly what you said. Maybe my brother didn't know how, so he didn't want to push on the bullet wounds. But she can't just blatantly say that. What were some of those instructions, and why can't she just say something like, well, my brother probably didn't know what he was doing, and maybe that's why he didn't do CPR? Well,
and it's interesting you point that out, because I noticed this listening throughout the day, is that she never says her brother. Unless she's saying self-defense. We'll get into this a little later, but when they're walking through the crime scene, she just keeps saying the shooter. She doesn't draw that line to her brother. And she's very vague, I think, intentionally to not draw that line to her brother, but she's asking these sorts of questions, and she's limited in what she can say. The judge said, as she's representing herself, she's going to be treated just like any other attorney. And there's a procedure and method to how you handle things in court. But something I do want to point out too, and what's interesting, speaking of instructions and maybe methods and tactics, is that one of those firefighters who was on the stand this morning mentioned something. I think Lori asked him something to the effect of, or maybe it was the prosecutor. So he was asked what he reviewed before his testimony today.
Sure.
And he indicated that he had reviewed his testimony in Idaho. And I think I picked up on that. I don't know if the jury did, because the case in Idaho has not been brought up at all at this
Interesting.
point. And, some of the producers in the courtroom, we were sitting there wondering, is this a way that it can be? Does that open a door to bring up her history in Idaho? And we know that, from court records, that it's something the prosecution is obviously aware of. And they said it's an aggravating factor, her past felonies. But It's been a question of when, if, and how, if they're even allowed to bring this up in court. And both the prosecutor and Lori Vallow Daybell in their opening statements talked about Lori's children, talked about Tylee, and talked about JJ. And
they were present.
They were present when this happened. And it'll be really interesting to see if the jury is connecting those dots kind of in between the lines, because there was mention of children. And in Arizona, as we mentioned, jurors are allowed to ask questions.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen that sort of question yet of what happened to the kids, or where are the kids in this, or how did they respond to this, or, but we're also very early on with all of this. So,
well, because I think what you're kind of getting at is that, Tylee and JJ were witnesses to this. And I heard Lori Vallow Daybell talking about Tylee being afraid of Charles in this moment. And so, if Tylee were alive, would she testify in support of Lori? I mean, that's a question that obviously we'll never get to know, because her life was taken away, and Vallow
by
Daybell
her
is
mother,
convicted of it.
By her mother. Yeah. And took her and husband, Chad Daybell. And likely her uncle, Alex Cox, who, again, we know he's a big name in this case, but he was also a big name in Idaho, but he died before charges in any of these cases were ever filed.
It seems like it would be really challenging to, when they asked the jury about this, did the jury have to say they didn't know about the previous case?
They had to have no knowledge of her at all. So that's locally, nationally, in Idaho and Hawaii, all the places this case has gone. And
wow,
it's that's why, again, going back to the jury selection, I was surprised how quickly we seated a jury, because they shouldn't have had background knowledge of this case. And it feels like this case is so big that a lot of people could have knowledge of that.
But then you listen to what we just listened to, and that back and forth, and Vallow Daybell, the way that she's asking those questions, she doesn't seem like the person who had these extreme religious beliefs that led her to doing the things that she's been convicted of, to killing her children. She seemed, I don't know,
it's been interesting, because we've heard her in televised interviews. We've heard her in her sentencing in Idaho kind of go into that religious diatribe.
Yeah.
And that's not the behavior we've seen in court so far, not in front of the judge, not in front of the jury. But it'll be interesting to see when the state starts, the state has said, we're going to be bringing in evidence about the dark religious beliefs. And it'll be interesting to see how she maybe responds to that. And when I say respond, I mean, she has to ask questions of, cross-examine. Lori will have her opportunity to present her own case down the line here. But I do want to point out too, that before everyone broke for lunch today, the jury was excused and there was a motion brought up. Just yesterday, on the day of opening statements, Lori Vallow Daybell filed another motion to try and dismiss the case.
Okay.
And this time she said, she's accusing the prosecution of not providing a full, extraction from Charles Vallow's phone.
Yeah.
And she said she got a report from it. And this has been a problem for her. It's come up in, proceedings leading up to this trial, because she said her expert, she's brought in an expert, and they didn't have enough time to review this. And the judge said, well, you could ask for a continuance, and she didn't want to do that. So she's moving forward and kind of trying to do this simultaneously while things are underway. So this hasn't been totally argued yet, but that was something that was brought up, and she got pretty testy in court about it, which is another feature we've seen from her, where she gets a little snappy and is kind of pushing on the prosecution or kind of asking things in maybe a more terse tone with the judge. Sure. And we have not seen that Lori Vallow Daybell in front of the jury yet either. So just some takeaways all before lunch today, but
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So yesterday, she cried, and you talked about that in yesterday's stream, that that's kind of a new thing now. And it just seems like there's so many different faces that we're getting to see play out through these trials.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, as we take it back to what they were really focusing on today, was it seems like, from her perspective, she's trying to come up with all these reasons why maybe they wouldn't have done the CPR, and then pivots a little bit into that crunching situation where she was seemingly trying to say that maybe he did do CPR and it just didn't result in a crunch. So it's kind of like having it both ways. It sounds
And that's, of course, again, with the nature of how you have to conduct yourself in court. She didn't come out and say that, but I think that's what she's trying to infer. That's what she's trying to translate to the jury, to say, just because, what I took away from that, where I thought she was going with that, was that my brother's not a professional. And we saw that again this afternoon when we heard from a Chandler detective. So far, all of the witnesses have been Chandler first responders. We had 2 police officers yesterday, and then we started with a firefighter yesterday, continued that testimony this morning, brought in another firefighter, and then this afternoon we are on another Chandler detective. And this particular detective, he's now retired, but at the time he was on the force, and he worked in some of that, maybe not reconstruction exactly, but he was the one who was taking photos and kind of surveying the scene after the fact. So we saw photos being introduced into evidence today. We also saw the bat that was used, this bat that was part of the struggle. And it was interesting. And a lot of these photos, I remember when Chandler Police released their case file to the public back in maybe 2021 or 2022, we saw all of these things. And, but a lot of this didn't come up in Idaho because the case was focused on the children and Tammy Daybell. So we didn't get a ton of the Charles Vallow story in there, even though this is all totally interconnected in Lori's grand scheme, according to all the investigators who worked on this case. But we started seeing some of those things that I found familiar from our reporting. But again, this is totally new to a jury. And it was, scenes from the home. There were some images of Charles on the ground. That's where, there were additional questions asked about CPR, showing, his body position. And then we get into the shooting itself. And something that the detective said on the stand was that he felt the second shot, or the shot to the abdomen, he felt that Alex Cox shot Charles while he was already on the ground, which again would go against Alex Cox's and now Lori Vallow Daybell's, his sister's self-defense claims. So that was some key testimony there. And then we also, then it pivoted after the state was done. Well, let me bring it back to one more thing that he said that stood out to me, was that they took pictures throughout the rest of the house. And he said, we did not find blood anywhere but around Charles Vallow. And then there was a little bit on a faucet in the kitchen sink. And they also said if Alex Cox had been wounded or injured by Charles, then this was part of the prosecutor's opening statements, then maybe there would have been a trail of blood. Maybe there would be blood somewhere else in the house. But that was not what happened. And then we also saw images of the gun that was apparently used in the crime. We saw that there were additional magazines in the home. This again goes back to the prosecutor's argument that Alex Cox was prepared. It was him and his sister who prepared to kind of lure Charles into the home that day and, conduct this shooting. And it was interesting because that all came out. And then, Lori comes up, and there was a bit of a delay before she was able to cross-examine. She said, "This is really important to me. Can we wait until tomorrow?" It was about a half hour left in court for the day.
Yeah.
And the judge said, "No, we have time. Let's get started." And so she starts and, again, comes up and is like, "And what's your name? And what's this?" And is of, it reminded me, if you recall, I know we've, a lot of you maybe have seen Keith Morrison's interview with Lori Vallow Daybell. And he described her, as being flirty almost. And that's that's the vibe I see in the courtroom. Again, the jury might be picking up on different things just because we have such extensive knowledge of this case. But, she started some of that questioning with him again, and she asked about maybe the position of the shooter. But then she started talking about shooting people in general. And I hope you guys can take a listen to some of this exchange.
Right. And you have taken many gun classes, right, that we heard of?
And I'm an instructor, yes.
And you're an instructor. So when you're taking a gun class, is it common for them to say, is it common that they tell you to shoot center mass? Is that a common term?
That is what we train as police officers, is to shoot center mass. It has the highest probability of guaranteeing a hit on the adversary that you're trying to shoot.
Right. So if you were being attacked, you should point at center mass. Is that correct?
That is what's trained, and because stress can obviously create issues, but yes.
Is it a common term to say to center mass?
No, that is something that I've heard, but I wouldn't classify it as common.
Would you teach that in your class?
It depends on what class is and what we're actually doing. If it's standard officers, no, I don't tell them to always shoot to center mass, no.
If it was a novice who was like taking a gun class for the first time, would you teach them that?
No.
What would you teach them?
You would teach them to shoot till the threat went away, and that can be with one shot. It can be with more than one shot.
Okay, that's fair.
So what she's talking about there and what she's trying to get him to say, again, without letting her make that argument or waiting until she does maybe make an argument regarding that, it seems like what she's trying to get at is this would be a normal thing to do. Maybe it's reasonable to shoot someone twice if you are afraid of them.
Yeah, I think what she's
trying
trying to translate to the jury is that if my brother felt threatened, why wouldn't he shoot someone twice? And yeah, that's tough. But
and this entire day, as we, even though we've heard more from Lori in kind of the segment, just because it seems interesting to hear that cross-examination, this is the prosecutor's case. And the prosecutor obviously looked at those first firefighters to say, you, as experts who arrived and first on scene, did not think CBR happened. The prosecutors brought in this person that we just heard from to make the argument that this isn't how you would act if you were.
No, and I will make one
self-defense.
quick clarification that these are witnesses they're calling. They haven't called experts at this point in time.
Okay.
So, and that's interesting because that has come up in court. This detective who you just heard from, Lori tried to not have him testify because the state said, hey, we want to call him as a firearms expert in later filings. But she was like, well, he responded to the scene. In what capacity is he, responding? So I just want to make that really quick clarification because it is, I think with all the court mumbo jumbo, it's easy to be like, okay, these people are,
they have
expertise. Exactly.
But they're not an expert on this case.
But it's something that Lori picks up on. And I think as we saw in that clip that was just played too, is she's using lingo that, you would hear in court, that you would hear in law enforcement. And it makes me wonder that, I'm like, where is she getting this from?
Because we talked about this too, actually.
It's interesting.
It is interesting because when she leaves court today, she goes back to
jail. She is at the Estrella jail here in Maricopa County in Phoenix, and she's been there since November 2023. She's claimed in interviews that she's in a cell 23 hours a day, and she said it's been a burden for her to prepare for her case because of her incarceration.
And we see her, sitting next to someone who's sort of seemingly helping her a little bit, right?
Yeah. So who we know, if you're watching the stream, is that she has advisory counsel. These would have been the people who would have been her public defenders if she were using them. And then she has an investigator who's been sitting next to her. So someone who's been helping her in the case. We she's paused a few points today before her cross-examination or during her cross-examination to say, may I have a minute to confer with my team? So she'll go back and forth. And it's been interesting because she's also cross-examined every witness so far.
Right.
In her trial in Idaho, she had representation there and they didn't always ask questions, or if they were very brief. Lori sets up a lot of foundation. She starts by saying, how long have you been working here? What was your role in this? What is your training? What's that? So she's asking a ton of questions, and you can tell that she's really zoned in on what's happening, as she should be. This is, she's standing trial, but she's clocked in a way that I don't think a lot of people maybe would have expected out of her representing herself.
I just think that, I feel like maybe I personally didn't expect it because in Idaho, she made a case that she was insane.
Well, she did not. She was found to be. We didn't hear anything from her in Idaho until her sentencing.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was an issue that came up in Idaho. And we talked about this on Inside the Courtroom yesterday. And it's not something that's come up at this trial, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But she was not, competency was not an issue for her here.
Yeah.
It ultimately was raised, but then, she kind of went through that process and ultimately was allowed to represent herself. So that's what we're seeing here.
Really interesting.
But, kind of winding down the day here, that's where we left off on that cross-examination. And we're going to continue with that tomorrow because she said this was a big cross-examination for her. So we're going to expect to see more questioning.
So just before we
I do have another thing that happened as well.
Explain a little bit so this person who, teaches these classes that we just listened to, what was his role on the day that Charles Vallow died?
He was a detective with Chandler Police Department, and he responded that day. So I know the sound that we're playing is a little snippet, and this was an officer, a longtime officer with the Chandler Police Department. It sounds like he's still on in some capacity doing their cold cases part-time, but he's technically retired. But he was one of the first responders that day. All of the witnesses we've heard so far have been people who responded to Lori's home on July 11th, 2019, the day Charles was shot.
So we'll expect to hear more from him tomorrow.
Yes. And on the point that she's representing herself, she's doing these cross-examinations. Before, the jury was dismissed for the day, and the judge, kind of told the sides, okay, here's what you need. There's an issue here. And he's told Lori, he cautioned her that when she's doing these cross-examinations, she's been remarking after some of the, questions she asks. Like she'll be like, oh, I didn't know that, or something like that. And he said she cannot be doing that because that is a version of testimony coming from her, and that is not something she should be doing. And I think, again, it goes to more of the casual conversation, maybe the little flirtiness that we're seeing from her. And again, that's a word that Keith Morrison with Dateline has used to describe his communication with her. This story is about, there's romance involved in this, it's about romantic partners too. So I think that's just, part of her essence in trying to communicate with certain people. But the judge said, no, you cannot be doing that. That's been an issue. And she was cautioned. So we'll see we'll see if she has any change in her tone going forward after that, warning from the judge.
Well, to that point, I guess I'll just mention that, yesterday we heard a little bit that from the prosecutor who argued part of the motive was so that she could be with Chad Daybell, who became her husband after the fact. That's maybe where the romance comes in, but he obviously isn't playing a very big role in this case. We haven't heard testimony about Chad Daybell.
No, and that's because the Maricopa County Attorney's Office did not press charges against Chad Daybell. The Chandler Police Department submitted charges for Chad Daybell. They thought he was part of this conspiracy, but they ultimately declined to prosecute him. And his name has come up. We understand that they will be bringing up text messages between Chad and Lori. So he will be part of this, but I think they're really, and by they, I mean the prosecution is really trying to drive the point that it was Lori and her brother.
Who conspired together to commit murder when Vallow Daybell says that it was self-defense.
Yeah. And that's, again, the essence of the case. So as we head into tomorrow, we, of course, will have more coverage for you guys here on Inside the Courtroom, but we're, again, expecting to resume tomorrow morning, 10:30 a.m. local time here in Arizona. We know, of course, there are ties to Idaho in this case, too. And in fact, before we go, I'll just say that there are people from Idaho here. Like, people have made the trip. In fact, Tom, a lot of people might be familiar with Tom, the juror. He was a juror on Lori Vallow's case in Idaho initially, and he's written books now. He's been very involved in the case. He's been sitting in each day. So he's here, just to show all of the people that this case touches. And I'll note too that some of these images were hard to see. We're expecting to hear from a medical examiner at some point in time, but we know that some of Charles's family has been in the courtroom as well. So, I know we talk a lot about Lori, but I do want to just emphasize before we head out tonight that this is really about justice for Charles too. And that's why this case is moving forward, because there are other victims in this besides Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. There are other people caught in this web.
He was murdered.
And there are family members who have been dealing with this year after year after year. And I know Dan, one of our partners here with KTVB, he made the great point yesterday that all of these trials have started. When we say all, I mean Lori's first trial, Chad Daybell's trial, and now this one have all started in April. So this has been almost an annual thing for the victims of this case. So that's really hard to stomach. So,
and this has been, he was killed in 2019. This has been a long time to wait for his siblings, for his family, for his friends.
Because we had to wait for everything in Idaho to play out first. So with that, everyone, thank you so much for joining us with Inside the Courtroom. We will be back tomorrow. We're planning to hear more testimony from that Chandler detective with Lori's cross-examination, and we hope you'll tune in. We'll be streaming it live on KTVB Plus as well as 12 Plus. So thank you so much.